Hi. So today I have a story actually to share
I like stories.
because it's about America and we are on the Explain USA.
Okay.
I have a friend of mine that's American,
Mm-hmm.
and when he comes, it's not you, no, it's different. And when he comes here and he drives a car,
Mhm.
he really struggling because he doesn't know how to use the manual. So
Right.
he always goes like. So the question then is, do all the cars now in USA has just automatic, or does it still use manual?
I'm so glad you asked. I'm prepared for this question, actually.
Good.
Let's do it.
That's it.
So, in fact, you were right to observe that a lot of Americans would have trouble driving manual
Mhm.
cars. I'm not sure what percentage of Americans can drive a manual, but I do know about the number of manual cars.
Okay.
It's becoming quite rare in the
Mhm.
US to have a manual transmission. Last couple of years, somewhere between 96 and 98% of the new cars sold were automatic.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, more and more car brands that in the past, like in 2006,
Mm-hmm.
about half of the new cars were available in automatic and manual
Okay.
versions.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just already in 2006.
Mhm.
Now it's like around 30%
Okay.
of the cars that are
So
offered.
it's rising a lot.
Yeah.
Do you know why? What is the reason?
Well, I'm also glad you asked that because there's an interesting history actually.
Okay.
Because on the European side, it's completely different. About
Mhm.
80% of the cars in Europe are manual,
Mm.
and an automatic is quite strange. Actually,
Yeah.
And I know it because my wife, as a
unusual.
European, when we
Mhm.
were living in the US, she
Yeah.
actually had to get used to and kind of learn to drive an
Mhm.
automatic. Well, I think one of the main things is that it is easier to drive an automatic transmission. I mean,
It-
it's automatic. It
Yeah,
means the
yeah,
car
yeah,
decides
yeah.
what gear it should be, and
Yeah.
you don't have to change things yourself.
Yeah.
So it does it for you. This is just easier.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, a lot of the comments that I saw online were explaining it, just saying that, well, it's because Americans are lazy.
Well, that could be one reason.
It could be, but I don't think it is. I mean, it depends on your definition of laziness. If it's that we see the hard way of doing things and the easy way of doing things, and we choose the easier way, that is kind
Yeah.
of an American tradition.
I don't think it's lazy. It's easier and easier.
it's
In this case, it's better.
It's innovation.
Yeah. If it's just on like normal car, I know that like for a rally car, you need the manual because it actually makes it more faster. But for
Right.
like normal driving, if you are not a sports car, I agree with the automatic.
And I think that's a factor is that for a long time, and this technology started in the 1950s,
Mm-hmm.
and even until now, there are several disadvantages of an automatic transmission,
Okay.
and that is that often it has less power.
Mm-hmm.
The automatic would have less power. You have less control, and the gas mileage,
And what do you mean by less power?
like less horsepower. Because if I understand correctly,
so-
like
okay.
some of the functions of the engine have to
Mhm.
go into
Okay.
the automatic
So
elements.
it
of the
wouldn't go as
transmission.
fast, or it wouldn't go to the certain maximum speed as fast.
Until recently. And
Until
that's
recently,
in all
okay.
in all of these categories, like the power, the control,
Mhm.
and the fuel efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, automatic transmissions in some
Mhm.
areas are starting to be about the
Mhm.
same as manual, but definitely for the decades past, the most advanced cars for racing or things like this would be manual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
So when it was first introduced, there were disadvantages,
Mm-hmm.
and it was more expensive. But it was very successful in the US
Mhm.
and not in Europe, and I think for several reasons.
Okay.
The interesting thing is how they marketed it.
Uh-huh.
And they marketed it very much as a car for women.
Okay.
So I read several
Uh-huh.
articles talking about the sexist marketing of the 1950s that managed to sell America on automatic cars. It was also very good timing because it was a time when the American economy was doing very well, and it was probably the first society in history where it was possible for a household to have 2 cars. So the man would have a car,
Oh, I see.
which should be the manual with
Right.
the stick shift and the power.
The horsepower.
Exactly. And if you're thinking about getting a second car, it would be a car for the little wife
A
who,
little.
the quotes I saw is, you know, like, oh yeah, the missus is afraid to shift, or she doesn't really have the power in her arms, so she needs something more gentle. And usually, like, the man would enjoy it also because it's easier. And in the US, we're driving longer distances.
True.
And so when you're on a long country road, like, you want less things to think about. And in the cities, because there was more car traffic, it's more stop and go, you say. And if you
Yeah.
have to change the gears every time that you stop and go, it's more convenient to have the automatic. So from the very beginning, the men probably liked the automatic transmission also, but they had to say that they were buying it for their wives.
Right.
And they had the financial ability to have 2 cars per household. So this kind of introduced automatic transmission much more quickly into the American context than the European context. And
So unless there's a 80% of women now in America, it means like it just enough too. So
and
they
as
got used to it.
once
and-
that ball started rolling,
Yeah.
also I think Americans were willing to spend more money on the car than a lot of Europeans in the 60s and 70s. And the American government subsidizes fuel and petrol much more than in Europe, which means gas is much cheaper in the US.
Yeah.
So the fuel efficiency was less of a factor in the US than it was in Europe.
Right.
Which means it fit very well to the American context, the economy, the infrastructure, the taxes, all of this. The opposite was true in Europe, where until it was much later that, you know, a European middle-class house could think of having 2 cars.
Yeah.
The streets are smaller, so you need a smaller car, and that's another thing. An automatic car needs a bit of a bigger engine.
Oh, okay.
So it's less practical because it's usually in a bigger car. Also, until
again,
recently.
until
Recently, right. And because they were bigger cars, in Europe they were taxed more because they caused more damage to the roads, which then made them more expensive again. And then this kind of created 2 different bubbles that at a certain point in America, people started learning only automatic and not learning how to drive a manual, which means those are people like me who could not buy a manual car because I don't know how to drive one.
But,
And I think most Americans don't.
but isn't like from manual to automatic probably more easier to get
No,
used
it's
to?
much easier the other way. It's much easier to learn manual and then to try automatic. Yeah, like
But
this.
I mean, like European, if somebody from Europe goes to America,
Right. This is
you
easier.
can buy the automatic one.
In
and
fact,
you'll be fine.
In a lot of countries in Europe, if you take the driving test, you decide if you take it automatic or manual car. If you take the manual driving test, you can automatically drive everything.
Right.
If you take the test with an automatic car, you are not allowed to drive a manual.
Oh, okay.
So there's definitely a difference in learning ability. But that means for Americans, since 98% of the new cars are automatic anyway, why would we take the extra trouble to learn to drive a manual?
Well, if you don't want to travel, then you don't have to travel.
Right. Now I should, and I've tried to find an opportunity for the last few years to learn to drive manual because now I live in Europe, but it just hasn't been necessary yet. And
So even when you had a car in US, it was automatic?
of course,
Of course. Because you had it like how many years ago? The first one, I mean.
Oh, my first car?
Your first one was automatic.
I've never driven a manual car.
Oh, okay.
I've never owned a manual car.
Okay. I never saw an automatic.
Okay. Well, if you go to the US, it's actually rare to see. I've actually noticed. I don't notice a lot about cars, but like when I get into a friend's car, sometimes it has happened that someone else gets in the passenger seat and says, "Oh, you have a manual. Wow!" Like it's something impressive. So it's quite rare. And here, I think it's starting to be more popular because the fuel efficiency is actually coming about even. But still, automatic cars are much more expensive here than manual cars. Recently, we were planning a trip to Croatia with my wife, and we were looking at renting a car.
Okay.
And of course, we wanted to rent a car that we could both drive and take turns. But for a week, the manual car was about $100, 100 euros or so. The automatic was twice as much. So not even talking about
like
fuel
American
efficiency.
price
It was right. It's a tax on Americans. That's what it is. So it made sense in the American context. I think that it will become more popular in Europe because the technology is coming to be about on the same level.
It will just take more time.
It will take more time, and it will have to get through the same barrier the social barrier of thinking that, well, real men drive stick shift. So, well, with the situation now in the US, it's now going to become more and more rare to see manuals because so many people can't drive a manual. It also means that even if you can drive a manual and you're thinking about buying a manual car, it will be hard to find someone to sell it to if you want to resell it because that market is shrinking. And in Europe, the automatic cars are still taxed in many cases much more than the manual cars. So this will kind of slow things down, but it is more practical and easier. So we'll see where things go. But for the moment, that's why Americans have automatic cars and Europeans have.
So that's why Americans cannot drive the manual one.
Whereas most Europeans, they could come, maybe they need like half an hour in the parking lot to get used to the automatic, but they'll be able to do it pretty easily.
So that's actually good advice. Like if you are going into Czech Republic from US, to be prepared for manual, and if you are going the other side, then be prepared for automatic.
And I mean, in both cases, you can rent the other type of car, but
it
would be more expensive.
Yeah, big difference.
Definitely in Europe, automatic cars are more expensive. I think in the US, to rent a manual car, it might be more expensive also.
Okay.
So if you know how to drive a manual, just know that you'll need 20 or 30 minutes with the car to kind of get used to it and take it slow, but you shouldn't have a problem. Now, Americans coming here, you should practice first.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I hope that was interesting.
Yeah, that was pretty interesting. Yeah. And you were really well prepared.
Thank you.
And we have many other well-prepared videos, so you should check that ones too.
If you would like to see our future videos that will also be very well prepared, I promise, please subscribe to this channel and even click that bell that YouTube has there so you'll be notified about our new videos.
So we can see you next time.
Bye.
See you.